Hello everybody, thank you all for tuning in. In this video, I'm going to show you a little bit about some techniques that I've implemented when it comes to building sections of a web page. More specifically, how to size things up and make them responsive accordingly. So without further ado, let's dig into the code. Okay, so I have a code pen here. You can actually find a link to this code pen in the description. And what I have set up right here is essentially a section that you'd see, say, on a web page. It could be one section of a whole web page of several sections on there. And I've set it up so it has a heading, subheading, and some body text. And when I shrink the window or the viewport down, it's responsive accordingly while still maintaining some padding on the left and right. The text wraps, and then as we get bigger, that space, that padding here, gradually increases until it reaches its maximum width, and then the sides just keep growing further out from there. And just to take a quick glimpse to see what I've written as far as HTML markup for this, I've written a section tag, which basically is this whole thing. It's set to take up 100% viewport width, so we don't have any gaps or anything at the bottom. And obviously I have an H1 here for the heading, where it says this is the heading text. Got this H2 for the subheading. And then I've got a couple P tags for each of the two body texts. Now you'll notice here that I set a little background image, with some color. That's just something I like to do. And not only that, but a lot of times you'll have sections that may have either a solid color or they may have a background image. Now obviously with background images sections, they have a little more styling to them, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do them with a background image in this video, since those are a little harder to do. And one more thing I wanted to show you before we dig into the CSS code is I've made this little control thing that you can toggle by hitting the escape key, which allows you to just set the root font size, for body text here that I've set for rem, and then you can also see the border, but I'll get back to that a little later. I actually have it right down here, and it's just toggled on via JavaScript with an event listener listening to the escape key. But let's dig into the CSS code here. Okay, so for the CSS, I'm bringing in the Poppins font from Google Fonts, and under the root I set some root variables, purple cyan, which is what I'm using for this little color blend over this image in the background here, and then setting some styling for all elements throughout, margin padding 0, box sizing border box, and then applying the Poppins font throughout. And then a selection tool just to give it a cool little selection thing, just an extra perk that I like to do just to go with the color theme. And then, this is some pretty standard stuff, scroll bar to the right hidden in case there's any overflow. And then I also set a full window height class, which is on this section container here, just so it fills the whole height. So if somebody has a monitor in portrait mode and their screen resolution height is definitely larger when they have their monitor oriented that way, that it just covers for that aspect. So coming back again to the CSS here. And one thing I kind of forgot to mention as I was explaining this thing with the full window height, normally you wouldn't set it for when you're doing a section to be the full viewport height, but because this is the only section we have on here, I just kind of wanted to cover that, but normally it would just be the height of whatever the content is. So I'll take this off real quick and just show you. This is how you'd normally have it. Well, it's actually filling the whole thing, but normally you would just have it take up this height, with whatever the padding is here and on the bottom, and then whatever the height of the content is. But again, because this is the only thing on there, I just kind of wanted to cover my bases with that. So that's something a little different on this that I normally wouldn't do when just making sections, especially when I have several of them. But anyhow, coming back to the code here. For the section, which is this whole thing that I was showing earlier with the full height, which has the background image, I've used the before and after pseudo selectors on there. And for the before and after, I've set them to absolute, which makes them fill this whole thing. It strips it out of the flow and basically allows you to sort of layer them. In this case, I'm layering them underneath the main section container that has the content in it. You could almost think of it like layering things in Photoshop. And then for the before one, I have the background size to cover, background repeat, no repeat, that layer. Think of it like 2 layers underneath this main one with the content. And then for the after, I just have a z-index of -1. And then before the -2, that kind of sets the order of which everything's layered underneath the section container. So the main section container element basically has a transparent background. And then these 2 pseudo ones that I created, which are the exact same width and height because I set them position absolute to fill up that whole space and reference relative to that section container. Those 2 are the ones where you're applying the image and the color underneath the section container, which is transparent. Now, you're probably wondering why I would do it that way, and the reason why I'm adding all that stuff instead of just adding the background image right into the main container is when I use the before and after pseudo selector, I can apply certain properties like opacity, blend mode, or I could do something like, say, transform skew, let's say 10 degrees. And you could do something like that where the whole thing's, skewing. Let's just go a little more extreme. And you could do, some cool effects. But if you were to just do that right on the section one, let's say you applied that same background image right on the main section container, then it would end up skewing everything. It would skew the content with it. Same thing if you did something like opacity on here, opacity 0.5. It would add opacity to all the content, whereas down here, I can add those properties, do things like that, and not have it have any effect on the content, since basically it's like another layer that's layering underneath the section container that has a transparent background with the content over it. So got all that there, and then I have the content container for the content, which is actually nested under the section container. In fact, those tools I showed you before, where I have this, you could click on the show border, and then this shows you the span of the content container with the content inside of it. Now, you're probably wondering, why would I nest a container inside that section container when I already have that section container already? Seems like you're doing a little bit more markup than you need to. Well, let me show you something. So you probably noticed that the content, this text right here in this box, is not really spanning the whole width, or it seems to have quite a bit of gap here and over there, as opposed to when I shrink it down. I'll take that little controller thing off. When I shrink it down, it seems to have a little less space here, but as I go wider, at a certain point, that space on both sides just seems to increase, and this doesn't get any bigger. The reason for that is because when a person is reading text, you want to kind of make it easy on their eyes so they're not having to scroll their eyes so much to the left and the right. And what I mean by that is, if I go over this content container and I take this width off, this width, by the way, is where it's setting basically a maximum width. I'm using this min property, 1200 pixels max and 100%. And what min will do is it will take the smallest of whatever the 2 values are. So the 100% will cause it to span here when the entire window viewport is less than 1200. And then once it becomes greater than 1200, it will stop growing widthwise, and it will just sort of lock itself in, which is why all that's happening. Now, if going back to me taking this off, if I take that off, now it's pretty much spanning the whole thing, and then this gap you have right here, I'll pull up my DevTools. I'll zoom out a little more, just to show you. Now it's spanning the whole thing minus the padding that you have right here from the section container. So, trying to read this on a wide screen, it's kind of hard for somebody with their eyes. They're having to scroll their eyes back and forth. So that's why we set a content container, and that's why we nest the content container within the section, because we obviously want the background image to span the full window width. So that one goes the full width, and then the content container only goes up to 1200 pixels wide. And that's the reason why we nest a content container within the section, for that reason. Now, one thing I want to do, since you're setting a limit of this content container to only be 1200 pixels wide, is you want to make sure you keep it centered, especially once the window gets wider than 1200 pixels. And one way to do that real easily is just set a margin 0 top and bottom, and then auto left and right, which automatic margin will just kind of push it all the way one way, and then the right pushes all the other way, and kind of centers it out, kind of meets it in the middle there. Because if you didn't have that, then it may work just fine down here, but once the window gets wider than 1200 pixels plus the additional padding on the sides, then it kind of stays to the left. So on wider screens, to keep the content container center, you'll want to make sure that you set this property here. This is just the way that I always do it, just to make sure that it stays center as the window gets wider and wider, so you don't have it just sitting to the left there. So for the most part, that summarizes pretty much how just the content container div is operating. I'll get back to the text stuff a little later, but I want to get back to the main section container, which is this whole thing with the whole background image with those before and after pseudo selectors. But I want to take this hide border off real quick, since we've kind of seen how that works. Hit escape to hide this thing. And then I want to go back, as I was saying, to the section container here, and go back to the CSS for it. And just focusing on the main section container, because we already discussed the whole before and after, which are layers underneath for the image, and then color layer over it to do just sort of a blending mode. I have a display flex with the flex direction of column, just to make everything stack. And I have a justify content center. Now, in a lot of cases, you won't really need this. In fact, I'll comment that out real fast. And you kind of notice that it's at the top here. But as I was mentioning earlier with that full window height thing, if I take that off, hit this render. Normally you wouldn't really need that much, or I should say you don't normally would need that flexbox container, because it's obviously this container is going to fit to the height of whatever the content is plus the padding here. But for an extra safe measure, I like to just add it in. So I'll just add this back in here so it fills the whole height. Hit save, and then justify content center, fill that. And it's probably good to just throw that in there anyway, because you just never know where you may run into a situation where you want a certain section on a page to fill up the whole window height. You know, if there's some animation in there and you want everybody to focus on it. So it's just a good thing to have to make sure everything stays centered, especially when you go on portrait display mode. Some people have their monitors rotated sideways. So there's one more property that I've set on this section container, which is actually pretty important, which is the padding, which was why you were getting these, gaps on the sides, top and bottom, that I've been mentioning. And I've set it padding wise to 100 pixels on the top and bottom, and then 4% of whatever the container width is on the left and the right. Okay, so for the padding of that section container, we've set the top and bottom to 100 pixels and the left to right to 4%. Why can't we just make it dynamic and set them all to percentage, say all to 4% of the container width? Let me show you something. The reason I've set the padding to 100 pixels on the top and bottom and 4% of whatever the container width is, in this case the full width, which is the same as doing viewport width, is because when the window grows and shrinks, you notice on the left and right that the amount of spacing gradually decreases here because it's setting its padding based on the percentage of this window here. And obviously, as it gets smaller, that number decreases. Now, I'm going to open up the dev tools here. Try and make this zoom out here. It's probably too much. And then I'm going to show you this right here, the Chrome DevTools, the whole box model here. And so this shows you the padding right here. And as I shrink, you see those numbers there. They're gradually decreasing, obviously, with the window height. But since we set 100 pixels on the top and bottom, it's not growing or shrinking with that. And I'm going to explain to you a little bit why I did it that way. So let's just change the settings on that padding there. Let's just say we wanted to do, hey, everything 4%. Hey, that 4% on the side was kind of cool. It, increased and decreased in size. Let me save this here real fast. And if you notice, sorry about this. And now as we shrink it down, now it's shrinking down on all four sides. But as you get a little smaller here, the amount of space is also decreasing. So when you're down on a mobile screen, down to here, there's just not much room here on the top and bottom. And people may look at this and say, gosh, you need a little more gap on the top. Well, that's the reason why for top and bottom, I prefer to more hard set it in. In this case, 100 pixels. That maintains that gap, because otherwise you get that shrinking and growing issue on the verticals. And I've seen that cause other problems in certain instances, say with negative margin, where an image was negative margin shifted to fill, halfway, to cover halfway between one section and another in a transition, and then as it shrunk, the image sort of moved down here, and then as you got wider and wider, shifted more and more and was more up here instead of being halfway. So generally with margins and paddings, you want to be careful about using percentages or viewport widths on the top and bottom. In this case, it's just better to just hard set it in pixels, so you always maintain an appropriate gap on the top and the bottom regardless of how wide the browser window is. And let's say we did kind of the opposite. Let's say instead of all 4%, we did something, let's say, let's just not quite do 100%. We'll just do 60 pixels. Save that. And now, as we shrink, top and bottom, it's still maintaining a gap. However, the smaller screen, we're still maintaining that same gap. So on smaller screens, everything's getting a little more squishy because we're still having a 60 pixel gap on all four sides. And this is 420. So if we go down to say 375, which is kind of the more common resolution for mobile devices, everything's a little squishy here. So for the left and the right, we still want a gap, but we want it to be a little smaller, so we're utilizing more of this narrower and narrower space. So if we change that back to the way it was before, 100 pixel top and bottom and 4% left and right, we still have the gap, but it's not as big. It gradually gets smaller and smaller because we need to utilize more and more of that space to fit the content because the screen is narrower. And then as we get wider and wider, we can grow that gap a little more because we have more space until finally it hits its maximum width. And then the sides just keep growing indefinitely, as wide as the screen can get. So that pretty much covers how the section and content container wrappers that wrap around all this text are working. Now I want to focus on the content itself, in particular this heading, this subtext, and this body text. So I'll just scroll down right here to the CSS for it. And I've got a heading here with a font size of min, so that dynamically adjusts. Same with the subheading. And then with the font size, I've set it to just 1.25 rem here, so then you can adjust there with the font size. So bringing back that tool that I've been turning on and off for border here, if we set the root font size, which is basically, I just set that up because it's a little easier than going in here. You'd normally do it right here, but this pretty much mimics the same thing. If I scale this up to large, let's say somebody wants to make it easier to read the text. The body text is obviously the smallest size of them. So one of the main reason actually why I set the font size to just rem on the body text is so that can scale more proportionally to make it easier to read. Now, with the heading and the subheading, those are already larger in size, so they're much easier to read. So those don't really need to scale up or down very much, because I could have them do that. I could set them all to rems, but then you're getting kind of the same effect as just zooming in, where everything is scaling proportionately. So a person may not want to deal with, this being really big. They just want to focus on being able to make it easier for them to read this smaller body text. So that's a big reason why I set just rem only on the body text, so that way a user can adjust that and only scale up the font size without, making everything else proportionately bigger, because then they have to scroll more down the page to read through the content. And I actually have a video on that if you check my channel, where I talk more about font sizing and everything, but just wanted to show you that really quickly. And then finally, one more time, I know I've been doing this a handful of times to show other things with the padding, but if you pay attention to the text, another reason I use the min property here is as I shrink it, the heading and the subheading kind of shrink down in size a bit. That way it prevents any overflow. So let's say you have a word with a lot of letters in there, you don't have it, overflowing and going past the right edge of the screen. Kind of make it responsive on smaller screens. This is down to like 320, and this is probably the smallest any mobile device browser window is going to have. So that just helps cover you on there, and then it'll also grow proportionately. And then obviously with the min, there's a maximum amount that'll grow, because if you just set this to viewport only, this could just keep growing indefinitely and get too big. So that's pretty much how I set everything with font sizes in general, and how I place everything. I do have a bit of margin on these as well to obviously give some space here, and then it's margin on the top. So using min or clamp properties on heading text for font size, same thing on the subtext, and then using solely rems so a user can scale the smaller text up a little bit more and not have this larger text scale up too much, since this is obviously much easier to read than that. Okay, so that pretty much sums up what I wanted to show in this video here. Now, I hope you guys maybe learned something out of this. Now, these aren't set in stone standards. This is just something that I've implemented through a bit of trial and error as my time as a web developer. Now, some of these rules, you may run into situations where you may have to go a little wider on the content width. You notice there I only set it to 1200 pixels, but you may have sections where you may have an image off to the left along with text onto the right in sort of a two-column layout, say for a bio. Now, in those cases, obviously you may want to go wider as far as the maximum width, maybe 1600s pixels per se, just so that text off to the right side is a little wider. It's not all squishy when you add that picture in there. But again, this is just something that I wanted to show you guys, something that's worked well for me. and it's something that you can take it or leave it, just do whatever you please. I do have, again, a link to this CodePen in the description below, and I thank you guys so much for watching.